Good afternoon, everyone. We're now past the vital June rent quarter day, and there are still many unanswered questions regarding ongoing tenant, landlord and banker negotiations, as well as how the commercial market will rebound in the new world. Those negotiations are often tense, but a solution needs to be found if the property sector and indeed the wider economy is to recover as quickly as possible. I'm Mike Phillips, UK editor at Bisnow, and today we're going to be looking at how landlords, tenants and bankers can find an alliance during this difficult time. Before we get started, I'd like to say a big thank you to our presenting partner, the Lorenz Consultancy. They're at the coalface of many of these discussions between landlord and tenant in today's market, and their knowledge and insight has been absolutely invaluable in helping us put together today's session together, so thank you so much to them. We've got a phenomenal panel to debate this topic today. Anthony Lorenz is Managing Director and Founder at Lorenz Consultancy. Mark Shipman is Director and Founder at Michael Elliott, and Steve Norris is Chairman at Soho Estates. Just a quick word on our platform before we get started. You can chat amongst yourselves using the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can also ask questions of our panellists as well using the Q&A tab. We're hoping to get to as many of those questions as we can today. I'd encourage you do ask them during the course of the conversation rather than just waiting to the end. You've got a much higher chance of getting your question answered if you ask it sort of through the course of the discussion rather than waiting till the end when they tend to pile up slightly. Thank you so much for joining us, gents. Stephen, I'm going to start with you. As I say, rent quarter day about a week ago. From the landlord's point of view, and Soho Estates obviously a major landlord in central London with a very mixed use portfolio. How was rent quarter day in terms of rent collection from your point of view?
Well, we've got, generally speaking, shops, pubs, clubs, bars, restaurants, theatres, the odd hotel, and pretty much every single one of them is closed. We're desperately trying through the Soho Festival initiative to close some of those small streets in Soho to maybe let some of our food and beverage people put tables out on the pavement and so on, but all the bureaucracy around that is awesome, and a council that frankly is more worried about 20 residents than thousands of workers doesn't make it any easier. We've collected about the same this quarter day as we did the last. Last time, I think it was because people had the money, but could think of better things to spend it on, particularly as they appeared to be told by government they could have a free overdraft from us as their landlord. Now, I think many of them would be pushed to pay. We've had 9 businesses go under, generally the smaller ones, but including, for example, Chiquitos, which is part of the restaurant group chain, which is filed for administration, so I don't think we'll see much there. This would be desperate times. We're lucky in the sense that we're a family business, as probably most people know. We're a private company. We're very lowly geared, so we will see this out and we will be out the other side. But frankly, you know, for a landlord, for example, that might have, I don't know, 40% gearing and who's got creditors pushing, these are pretty desperate times. I think the way that landlords have been treated is one of the worst features of the government's package. I realize that, you know, there's a lot of pain out there for a lot of people, but I suppose it was just government calculation that there are a lot fewer landlords than there are tenants, and they decided who they were going to back. So we're basically bankers, and the great difference is you don't even have to ask me for an overdraft, you just take one. In terms of what we're getting, I would say about a third of our rent roll, normal rent roll. And we can talk about whether it's deferment or holiday or whatever later, but that's roughly where we are.
Good stuff. Thanks for that overview, Steve. And Tony, from your point of view, you're negotiating on the behalf of a lot of tenants. How did you see the June quarter day going? What's your experience there? Tony, you're still on mute. We need to hear you.
Yeah, June quarter day has been a lot of movement. We started in March quarter day when landlords really did turn around and say it's not our problem. Landlords are suddenly seeing that not only do the tenants, as Steve mentioned, owe the March quarter day rent, but we've now got a deferment to September quarter day, and who knows whether the government's going to defer it to December quarter day eventually. And accordingly, landlords are owed 6 months rent. They certainly want a little bit of money in the coffers, and our advice to tenants is if you've got some money to put it in the landlord's coffers as a quid pro quo towards doing a rent-free deal or a waiver deal, all right, then it's worth actually using that money in order to satisfy the landlords. There are all sorts of deals which we're negotiating, with landlords giving 6 months rent-free periods and tenants putting an extra year on the lease at the end of it, because if they are going to trade, they're going to probably want to get that extra rent. And every negotiation is so different. But the one thing that doesn't seem to work, right, is landlords, unless companies are really well capitalized. And I think the most important thing is integrity, that tenants are bound to give absolutely full information, not only as to where they've come from, but where they got to prior to the March quarter day, where they are now, what their forecasts are in the future, and how they're going to survive. There's not much point in a landlord, and I'll take the landlord side on this, helping a tenant out, giving lots of rent-free periods and things like that, and then suddenly find they go bust further down the line. So landlords are looking at their investments and whether they started off looking at their investments, seeing whether they could improve them. And I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think we're all in the same boat. We've all been attacked by the same enemy. And I think the most disappointing thing is that the landlords haven't come on to the bankers have not come onto the landlords saying we can help you out. The mathematics of a rent-free period are very simple. If a tenant's paying 100,000 a year and needs 50,000 pounds to get him through, the landlord's investment value is about 2.5 million. So he's asking the landlord to reduce his investment value by 50,000 pounds out of 2.5 million. And if the tenant isn't too highly geared, and thank goodness Soho estates are quite lowly geared, but even if the bank increased the loan to value from 70% to 72.5%, that would cover the 6 months rent-free period which the tenant needs in order to keep a business surviving. I think every landlord is looking at every tenant on the basis of, do they want these particular operators or should they have different operators? And some landlords even want to redevelop properties and they don't want to help their tenants because they want them out anyway. So every single case is different. Transparency is number one. And I was on another webinar yesterday, which was savethehighstreet.com, where a very, very intelligent lady who works from Hertfordshire says that the most important word in all these negotiations should be empathy. And landlords have a reasonably good time when tenants are paying their rents and everything's going well. They have upward-only rent reviews, tenants are trading well. Soho estates rents have probably gone up by 30% over the last 5 years, right? And with a little bit of empathy, they need to give a little bit back, right? And otherwise, tenants just won't survive. And the last thing they want is to have 30% of Leicester Square empty, which is what will happen if everybody took the Asif Aziz line, saying we're not here to help our tenants. And
Sure.
I think the bankers should be helping the landlords helping the tenants. We're all in the boat together. And if we can get through this and make the West End look something like we know and love, I think we'd all be rejoicing at the end of the day. The market will come back, and if it's allowed to come back.
I'm gonna stop you there. And obviously, you know, for legal reasons, Asif Aziz isn't on here to defend himself, so we'll kind of leave individuals out of it. Mark, from your point of view, you own a big property management firm. What was it? How do you define the state of play between landlords and tenants after the recent quarter day?
Comparing this quarter day just gone to, say, March quarter day. So I think March quarter day we had an early 80% sort of collection success. This quarter day so far is looking more like 40%, and the area where I think we've, as Stephen alluded to, have been hit the most is the retail, restaurant, hospitality areas been decimated. So we have about 2,000 tenants and 200 properties. The portfolio is about 6 billion, and it's very London centric. So certain areas have been hit, even with office occupiers. So we've got some big office occupiers associated with the holiday travel world, which has been decimated, and there is a lot of sympathy from landlords. We act for, I suppose, a lot of our clients are very lowly geared, like Stephen's Soho estates, so they can afford to have a sympathetic ear. And to be candid with you, I think that from the landlord's side, the view is if the property is better left occupied, we'd rather a tenant there not paying any rent rather than a vacant building. So and we're looking at investment value moving forward. So it's quite brutal, but as the lockdown eases, we've got tenants beginning to open up and wake up and going back to normal. But we are, as I've discussed in the past with Tony, looking at rent deposits, where the tenants have reasonable sized rent deposits. We are allowed, giving a 5-day notification of what we're doing is going into the rent deposit, which some tenants are very happy. If we've got tenants about to face the wall, then we will go into the rent deposits and protect the client. And we have a duty of care to the banks as well as the clients. So we have about 400 rent deposit deeds, which are different to leases. They're not in leases. And it serves to protect both the lender and the landlord well. So we are keeping our heads above water from a client's point. London does have a habit of bouncing back quite quickly, as Stephen, I'm sure, knows, and Stephen's portfolio is Soho-centric, which is one of the greatest micro-locations in London. So we're looking forward to really getting going with restaurants, pubs, etc. next week. I've got my first lunch booked with a client. I'm looking forward to finally having cuisine that's not delivered to me in my office or made by my wife. So we are positive and excited, looking forward to what we think will be a bit of a bounce.
Sure. Tony, just while it's a great point, Mark, on rent deposits, and we had quite a few questions on this on our last webinar. What's your view on kind of utilising from both the landlord and tenant point of view, utilising the rent deposit in lieu of unpaid rent, Tony? Is that a strategy you'd advise?
Well, I think there's two issues on rent deposits. I think there's the rent deposit where a landlord asks, under the terms of the lease, asks the tenant immediately to top it up. And we've had one issue where landlords said, we'll take a rent deposit, but you've got to top it up within 21 days. Which is absolutely ridiculous because they can't do it. And another who's taking out of the rent deposit and actually working out a repayment plan, possibly every year or 2 years, when the tenant can top it up, right? And a landlord doesn't want to sit without a rent deposit. God forbid there's another coronavirus or some other similar attack. The landlord's main security is a rent deposit. It used to be guarantees, and it used to be bank guarantees, but most of those have gone out of the window now, and rent deposits are very useful assets to landlords. I think it's also beneficial for a tenant to allow a landlord to take his rent deposit out of the deposit, because the deposit's got no use until the end of the lease. And funnily enough, the less rent deposit that the landlord holds, the easier the dilapidations negotiation is for the tenant at the end of the lease. Because if the landlord's holding all the money, you've got to get it out of him in order to settle the dilapidations negotiations. So landlords are weakening their positions. I think they're very fair making suggestions of taking rents out of rent deposits where they're held, but they've also got to show some empathy and also be fair to the tenant about trying to top this rent deposit up again.
Sure. Steve, from your point of view, you mentioned those administrations and kind of CVAs that we're seeing in any sort of portfolio that has a bias towards retail and leisure. What are your views on, how quickly you'll be able to release that space? As Mark says, Soho, possibly the world's greatest, or one of the world's greatest kind of, restaurant and retail locations. So a great location, but how easy do you think it'll be to release that space once we're back to something approaching a normal market?
Well, that surely is the whole point, isn't it? It's when you think that we will be at a point where people are happy to go to a restaurant, go to a pub, stand next to somebody who they don't know, who may not have had the virus themselves, and so on. It's that whole business of a return of confidence, and whether you're the government or a landlord, or for that matter a tenant, there's no way you can individually affect that. Even the government can't do it. I think we've seen that government can give advice, and up to a point people will take it, but beyond that, as we saw, if you like, on the sort of Bournemouth Beach example the other day, people in the end will get bored and they'll do whatever they do. I think our view is that that isn't going to be in 2020, that's for sure. The only real question is whether, provided we don't have another very serious wave, which is possible. We're seeing what's happening in Leicester at the moment and other areas of the country where we do seem to have seen localized outbreaks. But provided we avoid a big second wave, then, perhaps by middle of 2021, you'll see things get back to normal. Now, in our case, yes, I mean, I'm damn sure that those properties that will be vacant then will be lettable. There's no question about that, because, in the end, people will still want to go out. I mean, we haven't, although we've all been, sort of learning Zoom and Teams and God knows whatever else, which thank God we've got, actually, because imagine what the world would be like if we didn't. But given that we've got this technology, there's no substitute for just, getting together. I mean, Mark was talking about, the fun of actually going and having a live encounter with a friend, a client, whatever, and that's not gonna change. I just want to add one thing though to what both Tony and Mark were saying, because it was really good sense, and it underlines in our case, because we need to make Soho different, because our slogan, I invented this naff slogan when I got there, which is edgy, not sleazy. And I don't want to be sleazy, but I've got to be edgy. I've got to be somewhere different and special in those streets, which are generally, low rise. We don't have a lot of skyscrapers there. This is low rise. It's very, very villagey. That means we already have the odd tenant who we help because we want them, because they're really valuable. I don't want to mention any names, but we'll keep them there because we really think they add to what makes Soho what it is. So I think the real key to all of this, Tony is renowned for this, and Mark obviously does it extremely well. You've got to know your tenants. You've got to know who they are. And in our case, there are some who we think are basically taking the Michael. And in due course, they're not going to get any holidays. They're not going to get any, anything other than a deferral. In some cases, frankly, we know if we want to keep them, there'll have to be some rent holiday down the line. And I'm not giving anything away when I say that, because the alternative is we just say goodbye and then we have to re-let the property. If we think they're good enough, we'd like to keep them. But this is, I think, the dilemma which every landlord will face. And, you take the point about rent deposits, it's quite interesting, and the relationship, Tony very shrewdly making the point about the relationship to delapse negotiations. One of the things I've found with a different hat on in developing offices and managing office buildings is that these days, the new offer, the new flexible workspace offer, which I think is going to be much more significant post the lockdown than it has been in the past, is generally an offer that gives you a one price inclusive fee, inclusive of your business rates, your service charge, your rental, and your delapse. And that's going to make a really interesting sort of new entry into the office market. I've no doubt about that, because that's what people are looking for. When you think of the amount of commercial space that's due to come on the market in the next year and two, a lot of it will be on the back of 10 and even 20-year leases. Ask yourself how much of that is going to relet on 10 and 20-year leases. And I think the answer is going to be a very, very, very small amount, because that's just not the way business is being conducted these days.
Sure. Mark, plenty of questions flowing in from the audience, and on that leasing point that Stephen's very aptly brought up there, lots of questions about kind of turnover leases. I'd love to get your point of view, A, from the leasing side, whether you're seeing a move towards people, requesting turnover leases, both for the kind of short term to sort of see them through this period, and also maybe longer term, and also, how you think that might, with your investment agent's hat on, how that affects the investment market, because obviously much less certainty over income on a turnover-based lease.
Well, I tell you, it was quite interesting. So the Cadogan estates typically would work there, and they are quite good managers of their assets. So they would let their retail on, say, 10-year terms outside landlord and tenant tax. The tenant has no protection, but within that lease, the tenant has to demonstrate what their turnover is, so they can see how well the tenant's trading. And therefore, I think that's quite a shrewd move in any event on going forward on maybe turnover. I mean, if you look at Soho, on the Soho Estates portfolio, and the buildings we bought and managed. In fact, we bought the Ann Summers last week in Wardour Street in 5 days, because we took the view that if we lost Ann Summers, and one day we may lose Ann Summers, it's a great spot. And we think there's a queue of quality retailers that want to be there. And so we see it as future growth. So on something like that, we would see a tenant wanting to pay, take a decent length lease on a proper rent rather than a turnover. I think typically where I see turnover rents, and we've done some big rental deals in Soho, Dean Street, Wagamama, 550,000 a year, Sticks and Sushi and Beak Street, 500,000 a year. We manage 151 Wardour Street, where you've got the office group upstairs who were great paying their rent, great company, paid this quarter. But downstairs, I think we had a chef there paying 500,000 a year. And so these rents, I think, on the big restaurants are not really sustainable. And it's highlighted by what's happened in this pandemic. Now, conversely, what the other argument I would say is, on these rebased rents, and the rents most areas have come down or will come down, I would say valuation yields, the yields have compressed. Why? Because we're heading towards negative interest rates. There was a 3-year gilt done in May at minus 0.0033. So the extremely wealthy people obviously wanting to protect their money. So I know people, we act for people in wealth preservation where they're getting not even 0.5% return cash on cash in the bank, but we can buy buildings 3-4% yield, really quite good covenants. So they'll pay a bit more for a building. So the guy we bought calibration of rents down, yields are coming down. So in effect, certain properties have maintained value. And we've had a couple of LPA receiverships. One we went to best bids yesterday, and another one in a few weeks' time, where actually property values have gone up in the West End. There's shortage, scarcity of supply. So whilst I think landlords can work with tenants in working out a deal, and without doubt, some of our clients will probably say, well, you know what? We don't want the tenant there. There might be a lack of empathy. And they might feel there is an alternative use value. And I'm aiming now at leisure, going away from leisure. And now with the government, as we know, introducing new planning laws, saying that, well, you know what, retail ground floor could go residential. They haven't defined whether it's just in the suburbs or whether it's takes into London, and going up 2 floors, permitted residential development. So there's a whole host of consideration in this mix on non-payment of rent, alternative use value, and where the property sits in value. But without doubt, we have been so damaged by retail. Forget COVID, the retail market was being blitzed anyway, affordability, online retailing. So we have a lot of issues ahead.
Tony, how are you seeing landlords and tenants using turnover-based leases as a model to try and get through the crisis? And if so, will it stick around in the longer term?
Well, 2 points. Firstly, Mark mentioned the Ann Summers building, which is built, and the cleverest investment that anybody can ever buy is an investment which stacks up on the existing yield which it's producing from the rent which Ann Summers are paying, and it's even better if Ann Summers move out. And this building looks up great old Compton Street. And it's one of the best pitches. It's one of the best pitches in Soho, so I understand it. As far as turnover rents are concerned, we're not as much involved in the retail as in the hospitality industry. The retail industry has had turnover rents for years in their shopping centres. And I don't agree with full turnover rents. What I agree with is that a tenant should pay the base rent, which he can afford to pay if he isn't making a profit, and the remainder of it, the remainder of the 50%, could be on some sort of turnover, or even better, an EBITDA rent. That if the tenant is actually making a profit, the landlord goes into his profit side. And there's some very, very clever landlords in London, including two particular brothers who are extremely well known, who do invest in their tenants in profits and things when they buy a restaurant, and they take a part of the profit as an overview to their rent, which makes the rent safer to come in. So I do agree with a mixture of rents and turnover rents. I think it's a very, very difficult thing to work out, because if you've got Graf who are next door to a sandwich bar, it's very difficult to work out what percentage of turnover Graf pay, right, who are selling diamonds for, kind of £200,000 and upwards, and the sandwich bar who sells a sandwich for £2 and upwards. But I'm not against turnover.
I think the key to
never have been.
Sorry, Tony. No, I was only going to say the key to this, though, is the point, surely, that it depends entirely on how desirable the property is.
Yeah.
As Mark says, in certain circumstances, I know that some of our stuff in Soho, I can say that, don't worry, I've got a lot of other people happy to take it. There'll be places and times where, actually, particularly if we like any kind of sort of retail offering or restaurant offering, we might well be prepared to say, okay, come on, we'll see how you get on. Because, in that kind of world, that can make the difference between getting something really new that wouldn't just get people in to have, a meal or to buy a particular kind of product that might be on sale, but would actually, leave them maybe going to the pub afterwards, going to a bar afterwards or whatever, doing something that will overall enhance our estate. So I think, it all depends. Some of the stuff on the retail market at the moment in secondary high streets, you can't give away. You can offer whatever terms you like. You're not going to get anybody bothering to take them. In other circumstances, as Mark says, you can charge what you like. I think it's all about, as I said earlier, it's about knowing your tenants. It's knowing tenants intimately, knowing the ones who, for example, will tell you that they can't pay, and you know perfectly well they can, and those who tell you they can't pay, and you know perfectly well they can't. And that's really.
I think you're 100% right, Steve. And the biggest problem that we've experienced with landlords, including you, and we've got 3 or 4 negotiations on with you at the moment, is credibility. All right, and if people are cheating, all right, which a lot of people do, and they do not need the help, and they're just jumping on the bandwagon and going to landlords and asking for rent-free periods when they can perfectly easily survive this recession, and they've built up their cash piles, they are actually destroying the integrity between landlords and tenants on actually sorting out fair deals. Because there's very, very few landlords that we've met. I did meet one this morning who was so hard-headed, I just turned around and said, well, it's off from me, it's now on to the liquidators. There's very few landlords who are so hard-headed that they want to lose a good tenant. We all want to come out of this recession with the curtains open and the stage setting looking something like it looked like when the curtains closed beforehand. We do not want to see the stage set firebombed, and none of us want to see the West End wrecked forever.
Can I just say, I mean, 2 things. Firstly, I think what is wrong is where I see substantial organisations getting a rent-free period, rent concessions, etc., and then to hear that potentially that the partners could be then taking large bonuses out of the business should not be allowed to happen. And you can just see that happening further down the road. And that is a protection, because we can't stack demands. The tenants, the government given a moratorium protecting the tenant, and in a way quite rightly so. And as Tony said, they're protected now till September, and it could go to December, although I don't think it will with release from lockdown. So that is one area that I am particularly concerned about. And the other thing is that what we are using time for now is probably good estate management. I think there'll be a resurgence of the independent retailers you know, we have found that the large multiples, and some of them very successful, where we might buy our sandwiches from, etc., are owned by private equity, and they're quite highly leveraged. And they've turned around and said, whether it's pharmaceutical supplies or food, that we're not paying the full rent, or we're not paying you rent at all. And that is a case of where we know they're trading okay, and they're getting away for not paying the rent, and they're threatening the CVAs.
Mark, you're completely spot on that. We used to call these people venture funds, but I actually think they're vulture funds. And when we go back, and it might be before your time, but it's certainly not before Steve's, when my dear friend was called the unacceptable face of capitalism, that's exactly what they're doing. Yeah. Right? They're buying groups which are in trouble, they're doing CVAs, and they're actually screwing up the market. All right, and they are not in property, they are not in the trading, they're just using their funding to make money. And unfortunately, they've caused a big problem in the integrity in the property market.
What was interesting on the CVA, say with Pressbury, Nick Leslie, is Travelodge. So Travelodge went into CVA, and actually, I mean, the hotels can't help it, they can't trade. But when you've got good product in good locations, you know, when lockdown is fully released and people can travel again, you know, the hotels will be full, etc. So they went into CVA, which upset, obviously, and worried Nick. They went to court, and the judge decided and agreed to put landlord's breaks into the leases. And Nick Leslie is a very smart man, and he's a good operator, and he's got good track record. So he has the ability, if they're not paying rent, to go, okay, you know what, I've got a team that I can put in, an external team, and I can actually get a better return on my money today over and beyond a rental obligation of a lease. So there are signs that this system could be protected and stop being abused on CVA.
Well, I thought that was a fantastic judgment. I think the judge should be really complimented.
Absolutely.
Because CVAs have been too easy to get away with without any backlash. And funnily enough, we're dealing with a very large building in West London where Travelodge have actually got a hotel. And part of the development scheme we're putting together is to get Travelodge out. And they did go to the CVA on that particular property. And the landlord is now wringing his hands to say that he can get Travelodge out of the building when it would have cost him millions to get them out previously. So I think that balanced judgment and balanced government is very important. And even though 80% of our work is tenant and only 20% is landlord, I think the government have so far been very, very tenant protected to the extent that it has angered landlords, and they do feel like they're at the suffering end of this, and that has actually stopped them showing the empathy to the tenants that they would have otherwise shown. Right. And the worst thing possible is the government allowing all the restaurants to open on July the 4th, because that actually gives a message to a lot of landlords, possibly not Steve Norris, because he knows his market, but a lot of landlords say, well, if you could open on July the 4th, why shouldn't you pay rent on July the 4th? But they don't really realise that turnover doesn't go back to normal until June 2021 or June 2022.
You know, a good lesson.
I think our view on that is that even at 1 metre social distancing, the average restaurant will probably be able to operate at about 70% of capacity. And as I'm sure both my colleagues know, in the restaurant business, that's possibly break even, because it's always that 30% that makes the money. When the place is full, you know, then you can make money. It's a terrible business to be in. I don't know if you've seen some of the published accounts of some of the really successful restaurateurs in this city. They're not particularly spectacular.
No, they're not. I can give you some good news that I was speaking to a client who is in Dubai yesterday, right? And the restaurants have opened in Dubai, and they are absolutely packed. You can't get a table in Nobu for the for the next month and a half in Dubai. All right, so I think there is a pent-up demand of people who want to go up to restaurants. I certainly don't think it's in older people like me. I think it's in younger people like you, Mark. All right, and I certainly wouldn't be rushing off to a restaurant personally, because I'm too worried about being one of the potential victims, you know, at my age. I do hope that restaurants do get back together again when they do start opening.
Yeah, I was only going to say I'd love to go to Dubai to go to a restaurant, but I'm worried that Priti Patel might not let me back in the country. So,
Mark, you were going to make a point earlier.
I'll tell you what is interesting. One of my best pals and a former partner of mine has a big serviced office business called Business Environment Group. And he is an amazing guy, as well as being a close friend. He has a very close relationship with his tenants, who he calls his customers. And he's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tenants in I don't know, 10 buildings. And they stay a very long time. They contract, they grow, and they stay within the umbrella, within his group. And he has a very high percentage of rents paid each month. He bills monthly, because of that relationship of the give and take, and you'll know that with Soho Estates, they've got a very good reputation with a close relationship with the tenants. Certainly on the office side, more so than the retail and hospitality. It seems that when landlords embrace their tenants and have that close relationship, it works really well. And from personal experience, you know, I can say my offices that I'm in, I wish I could, you know, get closer to my managing agents. We've had a lot of aggravation, and I leave myself open to.
I'll agree with you 100%. I'll agree with you 100%.
Landlord and tenant has to work together, and it can't be viewed as the wicked landlords. That perception shouldn't be there. It should always be the tenant does well, the landlord does well, the landlord does well, the tenant does well, and it should be a very, very long-term relationship. And a slow growth curve with the rents, etc. But good service providing, that should be the secret to success.
Agreed. The biggest problem that we have in our negotiations is with the inverted commas 35-year-old asset manager, right? Who's only got he's got one direction from his boss. I don't want to lose any rents. You can defer rent, but you can't actually give rent-free period. And the hurdles, the 3 months which we were given on the government moratorium, the first 2 months were convincing the asset manager that just deferment is kicking the can down the road and is not acceptable. All right, and it's taken the best part of 3 months to get landlords really talking. And give me somebody like Soho Estates, which is a family-run portfolio to deal with, who are sensible and know their tenants, even though they're not the easiest people to deal with, and I would not call you the easiest people to deal with, Steve, but at least you're sensible, and at least you listen. At least you listen to the plight that your tenant has got, and at least you then make a decision whether that plight is truthful. You ask the right questions, and then you make a decision whether you really need this operator or whether you don't need the operator. And if the operator is your best operator you could choose, it is best for you to keep the tenant. And if the operator is no good anyway, you may as well lose him and then go to the market and find another operator. And I accept that you should be completely commercial, all right? But I also accept that we are all under the same thunderstorm, the likes of which we've never seen before. And I did 74, 84, 94 and Lehman's 2008. And I've never seen anything about the worry that I've got about the central London that we're going to go back to. My crystal ball is completely fuzzy. I cannot see what we're going to go back to. I have no idea what we're going to go back to. It's the first time in my life that I've admitted that I haven't got a forecast as to what's going to happen with regard to where we stand today.
Just we're coming towards the end of our time, but 2 questions that are coming from the audience that I definitely want to get in before we finish up. Mark, a question from our audience, Jake Ferguson, saying he's sort of hearing that people are shaving their office tenancy requirements by about 30%, and even major corporates are now thinking, you know, more people are going to be working from home. We're going to need significantly less office space in the future. Is that something you're seeing in practice, or an idea that you ascribe to?
Yeah, there are two arguments here. Number one, social distancing in an office. So most offices, most tenants were fairly crammed in. So you would see back at house, almost bench seating side by side, which prior to the pandemic, the big corporates were saying, we need more space, our staff want to be spread out. So by definition, they need more floor space, and they will have to send people home probably in any event. People will have a choice whether they want to come in or not. A lot of people aren't coming back this year. I know a pal of mine in a big building in Soho, they're not coming back till January, or 25% of the staff will be. And let me knock this on the head. I know we keep talking about, oh, I prefer to work from home. Isn't that the future? I'm sorry, I do not prescribe to that. I think people need to, I don't want my staff, A, well, I can't see them, B, we can't press the flesh, C, we can't put ideas together, and D, hot summer working from home, sweating away. I'm sorry, I don't think the creatives like it either. So I think from affordability point, then yeah, companies are going to need to downsize, but it's not going to be easy to fill up their buildings, and there could be more space on the market. But we're going to come out of this, and we're going to come out of this with quantitative easing. The government's doing all they can to push us out of this, and whether it's a year, it takes a year to 2 years to come out the other side with a U or a V-shaped recovery. Bank of England said 2 days ago, we're actually seeing a comeback a bit quicker, and we now think we're back to a V-shaped recovery. I'm an optimist. I work with optimists. I see a lot of money out there and a lot of positivity.
Sure. Sorry, go on, Steve.
Suggest a slightly different scenario, because we've noticed over the years, over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, a move not to home working. You know, I'm very interested in transportation. I was a transport minister in the major government for 5 years. And what's interesting, for example, is the extent to which, you know, the travel to work area for London now, if you go up the East Coast main line, goes all the way to Newark, where people are buying houses for, you know, 4-bedroom detached houses for 360 grand and arbitraging the cost of the ticket against, you know, the mortgage. And what's interesting is that they're not doing home working. All the studies show that Mark's absolutely right. People don't like home working, but they do like flexible working.
Yes.
And that, I'm afraid, I think was already a trend, frankly. It was already there. And I think there's absolutely no doubt. I chair an AIM-listed business called Driver Group, which is essentially, it's a professional services business. So our asset is our people. They've been very comfortable working from home. Now they're going to want to meet and socialize, because human beings are social beings. But the reality is flexibility will say to businesses, do we really need the same space as we did? I've heard people say, and Mark in a sense mirrored this, that the biggest corporations in the world, the most successful companies in the world, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks, the rest of them, they actually have been aggregating great campuses, precisely because they say you only get true innovation when you get people together bouncing ideas off each other and so on. And that's undoubtedly true. But don't misunderstand the real point here. The trend is to more flexible working. That has implications across the board in London.
But if I could just say my bit, I agree with both Mark and Steve. I think that working from home was much easier when there wasn't any football and there wasn't any cricket and there wasn't any entertainment on sport. And I think that is now diminishing, and it's harder to keep your staff actually working from home, especially when they've got kids and working flat out at home. And it's much easier to do it in the office. I think that social distancing will increase the need for space. I think there will be, we're getting from our clients that 30% of their staff are going to be working from home. I agree with Mark that there was too few offices to start with, so there's still a pent-up demand. And most importantly, with regard to rents, and what I've seen in every recession, and that goes through 5 of them, is that when people downsize and somebody goes down from 15,000 to 7,500 square feet, they don't really care if they were paying £100 a square foot and they have to pay £110 a square foot for the smaller space, because their savings are around about £150 a foot anyway on the downsize. And we're already experiencing a very active office market where people are actually beginning to move from shared offices into their own buildings. We have 3 self-contained buildings under offer at the moment.
Sure. And just lastly, a question from Roger Cohen, Tony. If you've had a situation where either a landlord is being particularly truculent or a tenant is being particularly hard-arsed, what are the kind of strategies that are getting people to meet in the middle? Everyone sort of says, oh, you know, we need to share the pain and it's about sharing and sharing the burden. But what are the actual practical strategies for getting people from an entrenched position to a position of being willing to kind of share the pain? How do you do it in practice?
You can't deal with a hard-ass tenant to start with. The tenant has to have a genuine case, all right, for help. All right, and if he hasn't got a genuine case for help, I can't help him. All right, because the landlord is asking all the right questions, and the landlords will get to the bottom of what the situation is. All right, and the landlord will not give him help if he doesn't actually genuinely need it. Right, and the landlord's right not to give him help if the tenant doesn't genuinely need it. As far as a hard-ass landlord is concerned, I experienced one this morning, right, and it's straight through to David Bushler of Bushler Phillips, and we're going to put the company into liquidation, and then he can try and find another tenant who will offer him as much as we did. All right, so 2 fingers up to the hard-ass landlord, right, let him deal with his own building. Right, and unless the landlord has got a suitable covenant or a suitable rent deposit to fall back on, and you cannot deal with a hard-ass landlord. The law doesn't allow you to, and if he wants to be hard-ass, let him be hard-ass. But I think he's playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the gun.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Gentlemen, that's the end of our allotted time. So thank you so much for your insights and hints and tips and your views on the market there. That's absolutely invaluable in what is a very, very difficult and stressful time for people on all sides of this debate. So thank you so much for sharing on that. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us as well. In terms of Bisnow, our webinars are always coming thick and fast. If you have a view on kind of what's going on outside of London, we've got a great interview at 10:30 next Tuesday with Chris Oglesby of Bruntwood. They're a big noise, obviously, in Manchester and Birmingham, and at the leading edge of a lot of those sectors like life sciences, which are really starting to blossom in the UK. So he's a very interesting figure, and I'd urge you all to tune into that. But for now, thank you so much and have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much.
And can we thank you for hosting, because without you, it wouldn't go together the way it does. You've done fantastic, and thank you.
Who am I to stop you, Tony? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.